After the last light of the Mediterranean sun receded behind the Aventine hill, another Rome came to life. The crowded markets of the Forum, where merchants sold silk from the east and wine from the Campanian hills, were now a thing of the past. The clang of the forger's blacksmith was muffled in courtly courts. The eruption of the magistrates' screams dulled under the roar of the shadow, and the marble monoliths once blindingly white in the sun-withered shriveled forms against the gathering night. Yet Rome did not sleep, not entirely. Underneath the falling light, torches came into being like stars that fell from the heavens and landed in the hands of men. Lanterns swung from doorways, oil lamps burned at doorsteps and tavern tables. Shadows crept slack down cobbled streets, eating up corners and curling into the mouths of alleys. Some sorts of chuckling were heard from a pepina, a wine shop of the commonest class, and the quick clatter of sandals upon stone told of a patrol of the city. Watch. This was the time when secrets were said. That was when Rome murmured. The transformation of a city at time. In ancient Rome, night wasn't merely a change in lighting. It was an event, a daily metamorphosis. The cities close to 1 million souls reshuffled their schedule with the setting sun. As daylight disappeared from the streets, the Romans continued their business. Poor people, crammed into wood and crumbling brick apartment buildings, insulae, typically retired early. They could not afford oil to light lamps and torches, but not all. Some remained in the Vicaste alleys that wound like veins through the neighborhood, spinning tales, swapping rumors, sharing food beneath the starlight, or sitting alone with their thoughts as the world grew still. More prosperous individuals, however, in particular those from the domos, large private homes of the better districts, frequently partook of banquets which started in the early evening and lasted until midnight. A Roman social gathering was seldom very quiet. Music drifted over garden walls. The laughter of a woman, slightly too loud, gave away her delight, powered by wine. Blushful bacchanals lay in the shadows of the courts, where slaves, noiselessly gliding, bore trays of figs and olives, well-roasted dormice and amphora of Philinian wine. These were not simply nights of excess, at least not when it came to the powerful elite. They were political theater, opportunities to make the right connections, engage in intrigue, and build subtle alliances in the darkness. But beyond the dome, there was a different Rome. The urban nightscape Roman after-dark street was as capricious as it was alive. On main roads such as the Via Sacra or the Clivus Saborinus, the patrols would have been the vigils, urbani, the metropolitan city's fire watch and crude police force. They had lanterns, clubs, a couple of even had buckets of water. It provided reassurance to see them. Unless you had cause to shun them, the darkness was dangerous for many Romans. The boroughs were the haunt of thieves and cutpurses. Muggings, fistfights, and stabbings were not unusual. In the Subura especially, this densely packed quarter where the poor jostled with immigrants, actors, prostitutes and criminals, crime came as easily as sleep. The rich would never step out without an entourage of slaves and guards if they left their houses after nightfall. Here, in this uneasy nexus of danger and beauty, Rome's truest face came into view. You could come across an Egyptian priest whispering prayers to Isis at a small shrine set in the space between buildings under the moonlight. A Jew merchant would possibly be noisily raising the shutters of his small house shop in the dark, preparing for an early delivery. Greek actors rehearsed by torchlight in a courtyard and relished the acoustic reflection of sound off walls. Rome, melting pot of empires, was always humming, if only beneath the breath. And there, as well, were the lovers. Love and longing by lamplight. Love in Rome was not monolithic, and the night would let all of them emerge. Young men threw pebbles at shutters or pressed their lips against windows hoping for sight or a whisper from their beloved. Veiled courtesans paraded down better-lighted streets near temples and taverns, insinuously inviting. Subterranean trysts were born in the interstices between social classes, where status was suspended in darkness. There, in the lee of the Capitoline Hill, where the statues of the gods looked down upon the city from the heights of a temple, men gathered secretly, attracted to one another out of desire rather than by law. The talk was of poetry, in muted tones. A letter could be sneaked under a door, or given secretly by a slave. Rome wasn't insulated against romance. Its poets, at least of it, immortalized the games of love, but real passion tended to take refuge in the night. By day, Rome judged. By night, it forgave. the spirits of the city. The night was of the dead as well. Romans held the manes, the spirits of the dead, in high regard, and many left festival offerings of wine, bread, or a few coins at crossroads or at the tombs of ancestors after dark. The Compita crossroads was sacred. In this place lamps were burned, not only for light, but for pacification. It was thought that certain souls only roamed. Some were wronged, others unburied, and yet others cursed. The Acanthian Acatha, restless, malevolent, dead were the most feared. Special rituals were ritually enacted to drive them away during May's Lemuria festival. But on other nights a Roman might grasp a good luck talisman, or murmur a protective charm on a lonely walk beneath the moon. The stones of Rome are superstitious, but it was in vain, for the city had too much blood upon its soul to sleep in peace. A city that each story documented, or if the item. Recommendations hindered Ro to read more. Opens new window of the city, of the self Mumbai, a city that eats stories. Few people remember a Bombay without fluorosis. Even buildings felt differently. At night, in the city, the Colosseum, cavernous and dark, rose like a sleeping monster. The aqueducts glittered silver in the stars. The Palatine Hill, imperial residence, lay silent, shrouded in secrecy. Torches flickered on the arches of bridges that crossed the Tiber, its waters black as obsidian. The tale was told in the taverns and round the hearths, mouth to mouth, even as bread and wine. There was an account by a merchant of a strange wedding procession of cloaked men that was spotted not far from the Temple of Saturn. A former soldier swore that something could be heard moving through the old Cloaca Maxima of the ancient Sasua, from days long past. Speaking in tongues, one midwife said she had seen a baby born under a blood-red moon. Were these tales true? Perhaps not, but Rome was also founded on myth as much as stone. Stories were told in every part of the city, from the golden statues on the Palatine to the rats under the Subura. And at night, when the voice of the city weakened to a whisper, those stories were the very breath of Rome. After the last light of the Mediterranean sun receded behind the Aventine Hill, another Rome came to life. The crowded markets of the Forum, where merchants sold silk from the east and wine from the Campanian hills, were now a thing of the past. The clang of the forger's blacksmith was muffled in courtly courts. The eruption of the magistrates' screams dulled under the roar of the shadow, and the marble monoliths once blindingly white in the sun withered shriveled forms against the gathering night. Yet Rome did not sleep, not entirely. Underneath the falling light, torches came into being like stars that fell from the heavens and landed in the hands of men. Lanterns swung from doorways, oil lamps burned at doorsteps and tavern tables. Shadows crept slack down cobbled streets, eating up corners and curling into the mouths of alleys. Some sorts of chuckling were heard from a pepina, a wine shop of the commonest class, and the quick clatter of sandals upon stone told of a patrol of the city. Watch. This was the time when secrets were said. That was when Rome murmured. The transformation of a city at time. In ancient Rome, night wasn't merely a change in lighting. It was an event, a daily metamorphosis. The cities close to 1 million souls reshuffled their schedule with the setting sun. As daylight disappeared from the streets, the Romans continued their business. Poor people, crammed into wood and crumbling brick apartment buildings, insulae, typically retired early. They could not afford oil to light lamps and torches, but not all. Some remained in the Vicasta alleys that wound like veins through the neighborhood, spinning tales, swapping rumors, sharing food beneath the starlight, or sitting alone with their thoughts as the world grew still. More prosperous individuals, however, in particular those from the domos, large private homes of the better districts, frequently partook of banquets which started in the early evening and lasted until midnight. A Roman social gathering was seldom very quiet. Music drifted over garden walls. The laughter of a woman, slightly too loud, gave away her delight, powered by wine. Blushful bacchanals lay in the shadows of the courts, where slaves, noiselessly gliding, bore trays of figs and olives, well-roasted dormice and amphora of Philinian wine. These were not simply nights of excess, at least not when it came to the powerful elite. They were political theater, opportunities to make the right connections, engage in intrigue, and build subtle alliances in the darkness. But beyond the dome, there was a different Rome. The urban nightscape thrown an after-dark street was as capricious as it was alive. On main roads such as the Via Sacra or the Cliva Saborinus, the patrols would have been the vigils, urbani, the metropolitan city's fire watch and crude police force. They had lanterns, clubs, a couple of even had buckets of water. It provided reassurance to see them. Unless you had cause to shun them, the darkness was dangerous for many Romans. The boroughs were the haunt of thieves and cutpurses. Muggings, fistfights, and stabbings were not unusual. In the Subura, especially, this densely packed quarter where the poor jostled with immigrants, actors, prostitutes, and criminals, crime came as easily as sleep. The rich would never step out without an entourage of slaves and guards if they left their houses after nightfall. Here, in this uneasy nexus of danger and beauty, Rome's truest face came into view. You could come across an Egyptian priest whispering prayers to Isis at a small shrine set in the space between buildings under the moonlight. A Jew merchant would possibly be noisily raising the shutters of his small house shop in the dark, preparing for an early delivery. Greek actors rehearsed by torchlight in a courtyard and relished the acoustic reflection of sound off walls. Rome, melting pot of empires, was always humming, if only beneath the breath. And there, as well, were the lovers. Love and longing by lamplight. Love in Rome was not monolithic, and the night would let all of them emerge. Young men threw pebbles at shutters or pressed their lips against windows hoping for sight or a whisper from their beloved. Veiled courtesans paraded down better-lighted streets near temples and taverns, insinuously inviting. Subterranean trysts were born in the interstices between social classes, where status was suspended in darkness. There, in the lee of the Capitoline Hill, where the statues of the gods looked down upon the city from the heights of a temple, men gathered secretly, attracted to one another out of desire rather than by law. The talk was of poetry, in muted tones. A letter could be sneaked under a door, or given secretly by a slave. Rome wasn't insulated against romance. Its poets, at least of it, immortalized the games of love, but real passion tended to take refuge in the night. By day, Rome judged. By night, it forgave. The spirits of the city, the night was of the dead, as well. Romans held the manes, the spirits of the dead, in high regard, and many left festival offerings of wine, bread, or a few coins at crossroads, or at the tombs of ancestors after dark. The Compita crossroads was sacred. In this place lamps were burned, not only for light, but for pacification. It was thought that certain souls only roamed. Some were wronged, others unburied, and yet others cursed. The Acanthian Acatha, restless, malevolent, dead were the most feared. Special rituals were ritually enacted to drive them away during May's Lemuria festival. But on other nights a Roman might grasp a good luck talisman, or murmur a protective charm on a lonely walk beneath the moon. The stones of Rome are superstitious, but it was in vain, for the city had too much blood upon its soul to sleep in peace. A city that eats stories documented, or if the item. Recommendations hindered Ro to read more, opens new window of the city, of the self Mumbai, a city that eats stories. Few people remember a Bombay without fluorosis. Even buildings felt differently. At night, in the city, the Colosseum, cavernous and dark, rose like a sleeping monster. The aqueducts glittered silver in the stars. The Palatine Hill, imperial residence, lay silent, shrouded in secrecy. Torches flickered on the arches of bridges that crossed the Tiber, its waters black as obsidian. The tale was told in the taverns and round the hearths, mouth to mouth, even as bread and wine. There was an account by a merchant of a strange wedding procession of cloaked men that was spotted not far from the Temple of Saturn. A former soldier swore that something could be heard moving through the old Cloaca Maxima of the ancient Sesua from days long past. Speaking in tongues, one midwife said she had seen a baby born under a blood-red moon. Were these tales true? Perhaps not, but Rome was also founded on myth as much as stone. Stories were told in every part of the city, from the golden statues on the Palatine to the rats under the Subura. And at night, when the voice of the city weakened to a whisper, those stories were the very breath of Rome. In a clockless world, time was not kept, it was felt. The Roman day was a live thing, divided not into hours, but into lights and sounds. It was born with the dawn of cocks, and it died in the final guttering of a torch. But at night time was different, slower, heavier, holier. The city that fancied itself an exemplar of order and law inched its way toward chaos in the dark. In this chapter, we step into the night's invisible architecture, how the Romans, lacking modern clocks, measured time, tracked the heavens, and allowed myth and ritual to shape the silent hours. The sundials, silence during the day. The solarium, the Roman sundial, was in charge, set up in fora, in gardens, and even in temples. These contraptions cast shadows across engraved markers, dividing up the daylight into 12 hoary hours that shifted with the seasons. In summer, an hour could extend to almost 80 minutes. In winter, shrivel to as scant as 40-5. But at night, the sundial goes silent. And still the Romans counted time, not precisely, not mathematically, but spiritually, viscerally. The night has not been numbered, but sensed. The various darknesses were distinguished by color and significance. Crepusculum, twilight, a golden waning, when the sun fell behind the horizon and lanterns were illuminated both in homes and temples. Prima fax, the first torchlight. Slaves lit wall sconces. Processions to evening banquets began. Murmurs replaced chatter. In tempesta nox, the unseasonable night, dead of the night. The time that the worst of the worst crooks would have thought twice. The age of ghosts and fallen gods. Galicinium, the crowing of cocks. The first movement of light invisibly, incorrigibly concealed, but promised iluculum, the breaking of day. It wasn't the kind of thing that was marked by hands, on a clock or digital readouts. They were not sensed through the senses, not in any conventional way. They were sensed in the gut and through the skin. They were felt on a level below instinct. They were even seen in the way moonlight fell across a street, heard in the hushing of dogs, the petering of lyres, the quickening rhythm of breath in slumbering houses. Time, during the night, inhabited the flesh, observing the sky. The sky clocked more than torches kept the night bright in Rome. By looking up, the sky became a diagram of the divine order of all things. The stars weren't distant fires, but signs and signals and omens. When astrology circulated in Rome, it was not a parlor trick. It was a system of meaning. Families and the state each sought astrological advice. Wealthy Romans consulted astrologers before weddings, voyages, and political campaigns. Emperors were especially obsessed. Augustus insisted he had been born under the sign of Capricorn. He even put that sign on his coins. Suetonius reports that Tiberius never took a decision without the advice of his astrologer, and at night the heavens spoke their truths. The cycle of the moon controlled agriculture, rites, and religious celebrations. A full moon could call for a meeting at a temple of Diana, or a nocturnal rite to Luna. A blood moon urged waves of terror through the streets. Eclipses were harbinger of omens, not infrequently of imperial death. The stars also guided navigation. Sailors and merchants, those going to Ostia or coming from Alexandria, learned to read the constellations like they were maps. The rising of Orion, the curve of Ursa Major, the bright glint of Venus a few hours before dawn. These were clocks and calendars. But for many Romans, the stars were also companions. On hot Subura rooftops, children lay and whispered stories of gods. Lovers swore oaths beneath Venus. Somehow, a mother managed to keep her child close and whisper that Jupiter watched over them in a city that was often intoxicated by its own power. The stars told its people they were small and that the gods were always watching. The sacred hour, rites of the dark after sunset. Time was not just passive, it was sacred. The Roman night was broken up with rituals, public and private. That gave shape to the darkness. Every Roman house had its own lararium, a shrine to the household gods, the Lares and Pinates. But as the night descended, many families stopped to make an offering, a drop of wine, a whisper of thanks, and there was a glittering flame to honor the spirits that protected the house and hearth. In particularly devout households, they would pray at twilight, particularly during religious festivals. With the approach of Saturnalia, nights, candles, flickered in windows and songs rang into the darkness. On morning nights the houses grew sepulchral, the lamps burnt dim, and the pall of death seemed to spread heavier. Whole cults thrived beyond the home under the light of the moon. They imported the Egyptian cult of Isis, which held secret nocturnal services, cloaked in white. Worshippers chanted by lamplight, calling for rebirth and purity. Mithraic recruits, typically soldiers, gathered in subterranean caverns, their rituals bloody, clandestine, astrological, often played out after nightfall, well beyond the reach of the public eye. The orgiastic cult of Bacchus, though repressed in its most extravagant development, had yet its hidden lairs where it might lift its whip and yell. And the night did, after all, belong to the god of wine and madness. Rituals were not always solemn. Taverns were where gamblers murmured prayers to Fortuna before rolling dice. Prostitutes knotted cords, murmuring incantations to Venus to protect or seduce. In Rome, every act had a god. And every god had a time. Dreams as prophecy, when the light was put out and even the most restless had drifted off to sleep. The Romans thought the mind entered a realm of significance. Dreams were not idle imagination. They were messages from gods, from ancestors, from deep within the soul. A general on campaign could dream of a burning eagle and scrap his entire battle plan. A slave girl would look at flying above and think her freedom was near. Emperors retained dream interpreters at court. Dream manuals circulated that offered interpretations of different symbols. A snake, beware betrayal. A river, change is coming. A collapsing wall, the fall of power. One best-selling manual maintained that to dream of a full moon signifies the safety of coming birth. One warning which revealed that dreaming of falling into the Tiber brought public disgrace led Emmeline to venture a guess. A plague or cholera epidemic to the superstitious and many such men still lived. What one saw asleep was just as important as what one saw awake. The world of dreams was a second Rome, a deeper one, and each night, its gates flung open. Time's disobedience for all of these efforts, rituals and stars and divisions of night. Rome could never really master time, not when, in a split second, fire flared in a candlelit kitchen, or when a lover returned home late to find the shutters bolted, not when a soldier rapped on the door. With word of death from the provinces, night had its own will. The city might measure the hours, might pray for safety, might attempt to dispel the darkness, but time let out of the sun's control was like the Tiber, strong, muddy, out of control. And thus, the Romans learned to yield to it, to have faith in the sound of footsteps, the flicker of a flame, the rustle of a curtain, the whispering arteries of their own heart. The night was the unmeasured life, only memory. Only breath. Even the sound was gentle, the pulse of a city slumbering, beneath the stars whose age far exceeded its ancient stones. The story of Rome was also its streets, below the forums of marble, below the plazas filled with laughter and the echo of feet crossing stones, and the taverns with their guttering lamps. A second Rome lay, a darker Rome, a place of silence, of damp, of bones, a sunless place where sunlight never came, as darkness hung over the city above. It was as though the night also flowed downwards into the subterranean world of the canalis, of cisterns, of the catacombs, of the crypts and sewers, that ran beneath the eternal city in the same way that blood ran beneath the skin. For a while to live in Rome was to live in the presence of gods and emperors. It was also to live on top of the dead, on top of secrets, on top of something older than memory. Tonight, we descend the Cloaca Maxima, Rome's sewage system, an avenue of waste and wonder. It began with water. The Cloaca Maxima, the greatest sewer, was one of the oldest works of engineering in Rome. From the 6th century BC, once a stream, it had been vaulted and paved and converted into a vast underground canal to carry the city's waste into the Tiber. It was civilization's secret heartbeat. By day, few thought of it. At night, no one would dare approach. A gaping mouth by the Forum Boreum, the cloaca had swallowed the city's dirt. From baths and kitchens, slaughterhouses and latrines, the runoff coagulated into a black, putrid river. You used to be able to hear the sewer's low moan at dusk, mind you, especially after rain, and it would whoosh up through the storm grates like a giant exhaling. Even this sewer was sacred. However, Clocine, a minor goddess of cleanliness and sewers, guard the Cloaca Maxima of Rome, the Rigvedic Kaland, etc. A little shrine to her existed above its mouth, a paradox that filth too had its deity. Legends flocked, like a mist, to the ravine's edge at night. Others claimed the underworld's fugitives ran to take cover in its belly and were never clear again. Others mentioned odd lights under the grates, and whispered that the city's founders still walked the tunnels, uneasy, waiting. The sewer was something more than the plumbing. It was the underbelly of Rome, raw, ancient, alive, and it watched from below. The catacombs, sites of the dead, past the central streets, on the old roads, leaving Rome, particularly the Via Appia and Via Ostienswar, entrances to something even quieter. The catacombs, nothing to see. To the naked eye, just hillsides and brush. But to those in the know, there were doors in the earth, doors that led down. These underground cemeteries were developed by Christians, Jews and, sometimes, poor pagan families who could not afford cremation or tomb plots. Miles long, the narrow tunnels were lined with ranks of carved niches in which the dead were placed, usually wrapped in linen and sealed behind terracotta or marble slabs. At night, as the overworld slept, the catacombs remembered. The air was heavy, soggy, frigid. Your breath echoed, your tread raised the dust of ages. Ancient frescoes materialized in the candlelight of scenes involving fish, loabis, anchors, doves. Cryptic symbols engraved in Greek and Latin were prayers. In pace, they read, "She sleeps in Christ," awaiting the trumpet. At times, Christians assembled here under cover of darkness to pray in the shadows. Candles flickering, like stars beneath the earth, they whispered psalms as Roman soldiers patrolled overhead. They were the hours of danger, of daring, of comradeship. They did not think that the catacombs were the end, but that they were the waiting room. Rome may have feared them, but it was in the dark that the faithful found refuge. The necropolises, cities under the cities long before Christianity. The Romans developed immense necropolises, cities of the dead. No one was buried within the city walls by law, and other roads outside the gates grew up with avenues of memory. But time had its way. As ever more of the city was developed, the tombs became increasingly buried beneath new streets and homes. An entire stratum of Rome was submerged. Temples, mausoleums, columbaria. During the nights, the tales were spun that a woman saw a lighted candle's flame flickering up from her cellar floor and, digging down, discovered a lost tomb that a builder dropped through a floor and into a vault where a sarcophagus went, unopened for a millennium. The ghosts of emperors haunted under their own ruined temples as forgotten by the people they once dominated. These necropolises were not imagined. They are real. Today, we now know there is a Roman burial ground under the Vatican. Underneath the Trastevere, Etruscan tombs snore under modern foundations, and beneath the heart of the Capitoline, the very oldest stones of Rome murmur to the bedrock. The past is not gone. It is below us. The holy caves and the invisible Shrnset. Was not many dwelt in darkness who were mourned. Some caves were holy, one of the oldest and most venerable of Rome's sacred sites, and perhaps the Roman Acropolis was the Lupercal, the cave at the base of the Palatine Hill, where according to legend the she-wolf nursed the infant brothers Romulus and Remus. There, beneath the flickering torchlight, the festival of Lupercalia commenced each mid-February. The priests, called Lupercali, those who purify, would visit the cave, but not before sacrificing goats and a dog, and after drinking they would walk through Rome, striking citizens on the back of their hands with the skin thongs, symbolizing that women would have safe and easy childbirths. It was wild, primal, older than laws, older even than Rome. Other caves contained shrines to Mithras, a Persian god whose cult had rapidly spread among Roman soldiers. These Mithraea, always subterranean, were meant to approximate the cosmos. The ceilings were painted with stars. Their rites mimicked celestial battles. What it meant to be initiated into Mithras' mysteries was to be put to death, and to be born again out of the earth. And the rituals were always held by Light, always at night, because they thought rebirth must start in the dark. Ghosts in the stone, Rome's invisibles. Romans thought that the separation between the living and the dead was impenetrable. It was porous, down in the heart of the city, in its stone and shadow. That barrier waxed thin. They told of Lemures, the wandering souls of the unforgotten dead. They came at midnight, slipping in through clefts in tombstones, seeking peace or retribution. On May Lemuria nights, masters of the households would get up at midnight, and going through their houses barefoot, cast black beans to be haunted into the street, saying, as they did so, "With these I ransom me and mine." The beans were for the dead. The chant, a warning. Unburied and unjustly wronged could not rest. Their shadows remained, particularly down in the underworld dens where memory froze. And so the Romans erected defenses, amulets, iron jewelry, and nails driven into thresholds. Through the homes built over old cemeteries, people claimed they could hear footsteps. Some sweetness is still damp in the air. I could still smell smoke where no fire had burned. Rome's nights were crowded. Not only with people but with echoes, with memories. With things left undone. The sound of the deep what was it like down in Rome? Not silence. The underground city breathed. There was the dripping of moisture from ancient aqueducts, the scurrying of rats in long-abandoned hallways, the carts rolling away far overhead, the groan of ancient stones settling, wind moaning through an uninhabited hallway, the hum of candle flames. In these deepest catacombs, even your heartbeat seems to be a sound, louder than you've ever heard it before their time lost shape. Day and night were all the same there. There you knew that Rome was not an address, but was presence. The empire slept under the streets yet. When that darkness fell across the rooftops and the shadows deepened in alleys, another Rome came to life. Not the Rome of statues and senators, but the Rome of song, of dice, of drunken voices tumbling out the street. This was the real heartbeat of the city, here in the firelit tumult of its taverns, its food stalls, its street theaters and gambling parlors. The common people of Rome, plebeians, freedmen, merchants, soldiers, slaves found something, approaching freedom. The day belonged to duty, the night belonged to them. The Peppina, the people's tavern. Each district of Rome boasted its share of Peppina's simple street noisy wine shops, whose gloomy wooden doors opened wide at nightfall. From outside you'd hear the noise first, the clank of ceramic mugs, the laugh-tinged roar of voices, the thwack of hands on tables, the metallic rattle of dice cups. The air inside was heavy with smoke, vinegar, sweat, and roasted garlic. Oil lamps flickered low along the walls as if dancing along with each drunken movement. A Peppina was not just a bar, it was a stage, a forum for the forgotten. Behind the counter, shelves of amphorae were stacked, holding cheap wine cut with water, or something worse. For just a few coins, you could buy a night of bliss, or slip closer to a night of forgetfulness. Malsama sweet wine was the choice of the older drinkers. Soldiers liked it strong and tart. Vendors carried salted olives, beans, sausage and sometimes lentil soup, ladled from steaming pots to rough bowls. Here, class mattered less. A freedman could sit next to a baker. A Syrian merchant might arm wrestle a soldier. Prostitutes leaned in doorways, laughing like queens. Storytellers gathered around the fireside, exchanging a story for a cup. And in a corner, a poet that, man too poor even to drink wine, was muttering verses on a waxen tablet with fingers blackened with ink and hate. But the Peppina was more than a watering place. It was Rome's underbelly, loud, living, defiant, and the fire blazed well into the night. The ludus aleatoris, the game of dice in Peppina, and even on stoops and curbs, Romans would be found playing alea, games of dice that combined pure chance and skill. Dice were small, usually made of bone, ivory, bronze, or even glass. Some were square, others looked like today's 20-sided polyhedrons. He had acquired some kind of cookie-cutter die, the ones with the Roman numerals, and the number 1 with the spike in the middle, and dozens of 6-sided dice from a melted baby blue board game. Roman slang for gambling was everywhere. Alia est, the die is cast. They used tesserae simple dice, or played par et impar, odd or even, or duodecim scripta, a game whose likeness to modern backgammon is more or less certain. Rules differed, but wages were the same. Coins, favors, and potential, even clothing. Gambling was technically illegal. No one cared. At night, while the city watch was paid to turn a blind eye, the games continued. Tempers flared. Fists flew. Knives sometimes flashed. But mostly it was laughter, curses, and the increasingly constant clatter of ivory. Cubes on a wood board. Double your week's pay on a good night. A bad night could have you not even in your shoes. And in the flicker of the torchlight, money even had a mean face. Songs in the smoke, music of the streets. Rome's streets were never silent. Music floated in the twilight from opening courtyards of courtyard, from temple steps, from balconies illuminated by lanterns. There was a blend of music sounds coming from the city, the fragments of vociferous music, a lugubrious wail of a tibia, a double pipe flute, sound of drums, of rhythmic applause of the emperors. Professional musicians performed in the homes of the wealth, but in the poorer neighborhoods, music was spontaneous, a sigh of relief shared at the end of the day. Workers sang old Etruscan ballads. Young men bashed away at makeshift drums on stone. Lyres were played by exiles for the Greeks. Coin. Women sang lullabies from balconies, rocking their babies in cradles, suspended on ropes from ceiling beams. And then there were the buskers. And here and there by the baths of Titus, a company of tumblers were dancing in the torchlight, casting huge shadows on the wall of marble. Fire jugglers, near the Circus Maximus, stunned passers-by with sparks and flame, transforming night into a spectacle. And fathers and sons there as well, down at Trastevere, where comedians made biting cracks about politicians and gods alike. Carefully, of course, and a boy with no shoes sang in a voice that shut up entire corners. Rome's music was not refined, but it was real. It was pain and joy, hunger and hope distilled into sound. The night markets and hidden fire trade was not all over. At sundown. In some areas, itinerant vendors pushed out night stalls, basic wooden carts illuminated by lanterns and stoked with charcoal fires. These were not the merchants of spices and silks. These were purveyors of survival. They sold hot chickpea stew in clay basins, honeyed nuts in wax paper, a paste of anchovy and herbs, and bread that is stuffed, skewers of grilled liver coated in salt, spiced lentils with chopped greens. Lines formed. Quickly, kids ran errands for their mothers. Lovers shared bites. Strangers bartered in the glow. Some vendors quietly cooked illegally near temples or fountains. Still others paid off local officials in order to overlook smoke coming out of forbidden locations, and in the poorer insulae, Negbers huddled around communal fires on rooftops, boiling barley soup and gossiping late into the night. The city's upper crust ate in marble halls. The people dined by firelight, and grandmother could taste the food of endurance. The lovers, the fighters, the drifters. The night wasn't just for revelers. Some roamed Rome because they had nowhere to go. A runaway slave, hiding beneath a bridge, straining to hear the sound of pursuers. A widow, with no family, standing in front of the Temple of Vesta. A begging boy picking up coins scattered on the dusty ground. And yet, life persisted in the narrow streets around the Forum. Couples kissed, wordlessly, past dark columns. Soldiers found forbidden embrace. On the hills above the Tiber, watchers counted stars and the whispered names of the disappeared. Even the thugs had a spot. Fights broke out in front of taverns about debts, about women, about nothing. Knuckles cracked, blood spilled, friends pulled friends apart. The city watch came too late, or, in some cases, never. But in minutes, it was done. Rome had no time to dwell. The night moved on. Voices of the firelight. There was a circle, sub_igno_ for each fire in Rome at night. Stories reigned in taverns, in courtyards, in guardhouses and kitchens, in tents along the river, in doorways of shuttered shops. They told of the ghost which haunted the Appian Gate, with his gold lantern, the senator who went to a prostitute every evening dressed as a slave, the baker who made bread with aphrodisiacs, the temple statue that wept in real tears on the night of a storm. True, rarely believed, completely. The citizens of Rome did not want the truth. They needed voice, fire, laughter, fear, connection. And they told their stories under the stars, the same stars by which Romulus had traced the first line in the dust. Stars, who the same stars had shone over emperors and beggars. The sun ruled the Senate, but the Republic was governed by the moon, for in Rome true power hadn't always worn a laurel wreath in the light of day. It wafted behind the scenes, hooded figures slipping behind guards, murmured plots in pillared courtyards, scrolls passed under smudged torchlight, names whispered into a void. The eternal city was ruled not only by laws and legions, but secrets, and secrets, in Rome, were the property of the night. The Villa of Silence, the decisions, were made here. It was late, too late for the guests, too early for sunrise, but there was still lamplight in the domus on the Palatine Hill. Voices murmured low and fast through its open courtyard, on down the corridors that were guarded with busts of ancestors. A senator was at the head of the table, his fingers curled around a goblet of wine that had long since lost its heat. Before him were two men in plain tunics, one a freedman, the other an envoy from Alexandria. What they bore was not heavy, but it might move the weight of empires. Scroll wrapped and sealed with wax, as shaped in the sign of a foreign king. Noble Romans frequently held their most significant meetings at night. Why? Daylight meant visibility, servants, guards, gossips, and rivals. But darkness Darkness brought discretion, with the copper blaze ambered to it. Ambition honed like a knife in candlelight. Editors bargained with magistrates and usurers. Marriage contracts were settled by uncles at malabanquets over garum and figs. And sometimes, often, information circulated hand to hand, like poison in a chalice. In this villa, and 100 others, Rome wasn't formed by booming oratory in the forum, but by silent agreements in the dark. Espionage in the empire. The Roman knight had ears. Every villa had its slaves, every palace its scribes, every general his informants. These eyes and ears became the tools of intelligence and of survival. In such a colossal empire, where it took as long to spread rumors from Britannia to Syria as it did to arrange a triumph, espionage was less an exception than an everyday affair. An Emperor Tiberius, holed up in his island villa on Capri, employed a network of spies so terrifying senators quaked to speak in private. Caligula weaponized suspicion. Nero planted agents in the theater troupes and taverns to listen for satire and sedition. So much of this surveillance occurred in darkness at night. Messengers crept through postern gates. Documents were copied by lamplight and hidden in the loaves of bread or sewn into garments. Coded messages were sent between mistresses and magistrates by the hands of slaves. Spies trailed rival senators from shadow to shadow. Never known, only feared. Rome did not have a modern intelligence service. It didn't need one. The knight took care of that. The art of the private audience, her writing on Cardinal Lorraine, gives a good example. As an invitation to private audience after dark, it was a great honor or a deadly threat in the higher levels of Roman society. Discussions could also be conducted that daylight could not tolerate through late-night visits, so-called conventus not. The gatherings were shrouded in protocol and peril. The powerful didn't always want witnesses. A general home from the campaign could show up unannounced at the door of a senator's home well after midnight, dressed in a dark cloak, offering gifts or giving orders. An ex-consul could come to the door of a rival's domus, bringing news of a changing alliance or begging for mercy. Doors were opened cautiously. Lamps were lowered. Discussions in muffled Latin or whispered Greek. A misplaced word could result in one's exile, or worse. And at times, those wielding the most power did not wait for others to come to them. Rather, they came themselves. There are stories half-false fully believed of emperors pulling on simple robes, sliding out of the Palatine, in the servants' clothing, to test loyalties, soak up overheard conversation, check the temperature of the street. Domitian had walked Trastevere undisguised, watching, listening. To reign in Rome was to suspect in Rome, and thus the night was the emperor's mirror. Assassination and the midnight bladesome were strengthened by the night. Others found death. Assassination in Rome was customarily a planned act. The crime was rarely an impulsive act of passion. It was a choreography, designed, shrouded in ritual, almost always choreographed for the night. It's a fact that Julius Caesar went down in the middle of the day, but the conspiracy against him took shape in whispering meetings in lamplit atriums. Servants were sent away, doors sealed, swords smuggled beneath benches. Later plots were more direct. Caligula was stabbed in a hallway after a private theatrical performance, killed by his own guard as the torchlight flickered along the halls. Domitian, paranoid and cruel, contemplated his death in his bedroom at the hands of men whom he trusted with his life. Wasting before the day could break, senators plotted over scrolls. Gladiators were paid by generals to switch sides. Names were whispered in the ears of power as fingers brushed naked flesh. In this respect, Rome was not a republic these days, nor an empire. It was a stage, and the script was there in shadows. All the time, the Palatine by torchlight to walk the Palatine. Hill by night was to walk within the power, from the Domos Tiberiana to the great Flavian Palace. The lamps burned in waves golden firelight playing off the arches, the fountains, the painted frescoes of gods and heroes, and victories both real and imagined. The guards were so still that they might have been statues, their armor catching on the low flame. The halls murmured with the sound of silk, leather, and naked feet. Somewhere there was music too soft for rejoicing, too sad for joy. The emperor ate silently, or watched a dancer spin, or read dispatches by lamplight, measuring the loyalty of each province like weights on a scale. The Palatine served as castle and stage, a place where the illusion became governance, and night allowed it to bare its teeth. The face behind every mask of marble was that of a mind calculated. weighing its chances of survival. And ambition, or death, lay in every corridor. Whispers in the atrium. The Roman nobles resided in domas with open atriums, courts that captured not only rain but stars. In the day, this were business, clients, and ceremony. By night, the atrium was now a room for plotting in silence. Now here, amid statues of forebears and winking altars to domestic divinities, the head of a noble family could sit on a stone bench, reflecting, alone, weighing whom to trust, which friend to betray, which marriage to arrange, which debt to forgive, which name to write down, or erase. Although sometimes selected at boisterous Roman conclaves, power in Rome was not always loud. Occasionally, it was just staying awake, when others slept. Waiting. Watching. The knowledge that in the silence of the fourth hour of night, a whispered sentence between two men could nudge the levers of empire. As the day retreated behind the Tiber and shadows veiled the hills of Rome, the city's temples never grew silent. They awakened. The gods of Rome, they were never far from a Roman's mind, were nearest at night. Their statues stood larger in the lamplight, their altars dotting the city like stardust, throbbed with holy fire, and their secrets, sealed in rituals and incantations, were revealed at night. The divine was not some remote abstraction for the ancient Romans. It was present, personal, political, terrifying, and by night, when edges blurred and silence leaned into stone, the gods listened more closely. Or, so it was believed, the sacred fires of Vesta. In the center of the Forum Romanum rose, a tribune, small edifice but large in significance, the Temple of Vesta. Inside burned the eternal flame, cared for by the Vestal virgins, priestesses sworn to live in purity and labor in service. The fire represented the life of Rome. It was never allowed to die. Day or night, it was guarded, fed and worshipped. While the majority of rituals would take place during the day, the hours of darkness had their own significance. If the flame flickered too low or snuffed out in the night, it was a terrible omen. Once the Vestals, hulking figures covered in white robes and cloth bonnets, would light the flame early the following day, and many would shed silent tears, because they knew what lighting the beacon might mean. The security and safety of Rome rested on this tiny flicker of light. When streets lay dark and crime slunk alleys, a single torch in Vesta's temple kept up the battle against chaos. A symbol, warning, a prayer. The moonlit rites of Diana upon the Aventine Hill and in the hallowed woods outside the city. Another great goddess was celebrated as the sun dipped low. Diana, goddess of the hunt, of the wild, of the moon. Diana was not the neat, state gods. She was one with the trees, the shadows, the animals. Her temples received women, slaves, outcasts, people who did not always have space in Roman society. On nights of the full moon, processions brought offerings, wreaths, fruits, honeycakes, all carved likenesses to her altars. Rituals were sometimes punctuated by chanting water or walking in silence through groves. Girls prayed for protection. Midwives called on her before difficult births. Runaways whispered to her about escaping. Diana had a goddess of the night, and the city, a guardian. To some, she was wild. To others, she was justice. And always, she was watching. The temples of the dusk, holy geometry in Shadow Rome, was a city of temples. Every hill, every main crossroad, every military camp had one minder like that. Jupiter, Optimus, Maximus on the Capitoline, Mars' altar in the Forum of Augustus, Minerva near the Campus Mars. Even lesser gods had shrines in allying and ETHN houses. At night, these structures transformed. The moonlight shimmered against the marble. Torches mounted on columns throw shadows down long bas-reliefs and mosaics. Statues loomed with hollow eyes. Priests in ceremonial garments worked silently. The flamens and augurs made offerings, bread, wine, incense, animals, to placate or beg attention of the gods. Although most public rituals were performed during the day, certain nocturnal ceremonies were of great significance. The augurium, canarium, conducted at night to prevent calamities by sacrificing red dogs to the deities of pestilence. The supplicationa, an emergency prayer retreat, conducted when omens of disaster appeared. Comets, earthquakes, eclipses, ritual of the moon goddess Luna, was held only by night, in darkness itself, no less, with golden lamps, having a silvery sheen. No death was presented, but the heads of poppies were mutilated, and over her station priests called, who I do not think could be conceived of any more unpleasant tribe or of sort of that beast. If during the long nights in Rome you were walking by a temple after nightfall, the feel of the sight of hooded priests walking through the drummed-up light of a blazing fire would be reassurances tinged with unrest. The gods were near, and they were awake. The secret cults and mysteries, but not all worship in Rome was as organized as that of the state. As the empire grew, it incorporated religions of foreigners, some officially, some secretly. By night, these faiths thrived in clandestine halls, subterranean rooms, and candlelit meetings. The Egyptian imported cult of Isis conducted nighttime processions, with priests dressed in linen and singing in foreign languages. Her followers thought her in charge of the moon's cycles and the protector of those who walked in the night. Mithraism, the cult that Roman soldiers most favored, focused its initiations on darkened Mithria, subterranean temples designed to ape caves. New members fasted, were blindfolded, and underwent ordeals by lamplight. Its centerpiece was a ceremony in which the god Mithras killed a bull, representing rebirth through blood and darkness. The Senate prohibited the Dionysian mysteries because of their wild, nightly ceremonies, but they persisted in secret. This is what the followers of Bacchus, who danced raving at night in woods outside the city, or closed doors, did. They swilled, and drank, and sang, and were filled with the madness of inspiration. These cults offered something the old gods did not often provide: personal salvation, transformation, mystery. And the Romans thought mystery was associated with the night. Devotions of the home, the lares in the firelight. Although temples were the most visible aspect of Roman public religion, most Romans practiced religious beliefs and rituals. In their own home, each domus possessed a lararium, a shrine to the lares and pinities of the house. Families lit little oil lamps before these shrines at night. Before bed, they poured out wine, scattered crumbs of bread, sometimes laid a flower or a lock of hair. They prayed for protection. They prayed for dreams with no portent. They would give thanks to the gods that they were alive of birth, of illness, of the day's risks. In the humbler homes of the insulae, the meanest tenants had scratched altars on the walls. A coin slipped down to the toe of a statuette. A garland hung from a shelf. The gods of the state ruled, and they ruled from marble. No, the gods of the night reigned in clay, and they were everywhere. Omens in the night. To be Roman was to read the world. And signs were everywhere that night. An owl hooting by a window could mean a death. 3 howls of a dog was the worst one. In one dream, his country was on fire, a precursor to a political upheaval. The sudden puff of breath that blew out a lamp in the middle of a prayer was a dire omen. The augurs observed the flight of birds at the first dawn. The people watched at midnight. The shadows, such soothsayers, strolled the streets and would interpret dreams for a coin. Women would rub the talisman with olive oil and hang it over a bed. Soldiers wore crescent charms. Children would be tattooed with protective vestiga, or the tattoos to ward away the nocturni umbrinite spirits. And when thunder clapped across the sky, with no storm or lightning, even the skeptics were still for a moment. The gods, they were told, were coming. The godless hours, but they were hours when even the gods were hidden. In Tempesta Nox, the middle of the night, the third watch, it was the time when the Vestals were at rest. The temples locked their gates. The altars went dark. That was when the prayers began to be whispered, not to the gods but to fate. Even the one Piats, the fates who spun and cut the thread of life, were not wont to be worshipped with sacrifice. They were appeased with silence. During these hours, a man coming home alone could pause to touch a wall, minding his distance from the objects and other men along his route. Not that he feared men, but that he feared what the gods might be disposed to allow. In Rome, it wasn't always a matter of reverence. Sometimes it was about protection. As the city slept and the stars inched ever so slowly across the sky, others remained awake now by obligation, not by choice. Rome was lavish, busy and holy, but it was also vulnerable. A city of wood that propped up dingy tenements, stacked 5 stories high, with narrow alleys full of flammable junk and dog carcasses, sewers that gurgled in the dark, and tens of thousands of bodies, shoulder to shoulder while they slept. And in a city like that, a single flame, a single scream, a single scream, a single crime could become a catastrophe. So Rome invented its own nocturnal guardians, not knights or mythic figures, but flesh and blood men, sodden, tired, and sometimes underappreciated. They were the vigils, and they presided over the night, as anxious gods visiting mortals. The vigils, Rome's firefighters and keepers of the peace established around 06 CE by Augustus, following a spate of devastating fires. The vigils urbani were a unique force, part firemen, part policemen, part night watchmen. Initially made up of freedmen, they had originally consisted of about 7,000 men and were organized into 7 cohorts, with each cohort having jurisdiction of 2 of Rome's 14 regions. Their watchword was simple: vigilando. By watching, the vigils spread through the city each night, dressed in leather or rough woolen tunics, wielding pails or axes or short swords. They strode through the slums and merchant quarters and tavern-marked thoroughfare, wealthy by the gardens of the Palatine and the They took turns alleys and rooftops, hearing for trouble, searching for smoke. They did not shout orders. They whispered. They watched. They knew every door ajar, every quiet rooftop, every suspicious flicker. Their presence wasn't always welcomed. In the less reputable neighborhoods, the vigils were considered spies, and in the higher ones, as in those of servants. But to those whose homes were spared the torch, or whose children were restored when a thief was apprehended, they were protectors, invisible, but present. Always. Sparks FD, putting out a structure firearm burned. It always had. Even in Augustus' day, the city was a tinderbox, walls made of dry wood, oil lamps all over the place, kitchens using open flames, and no water pressure too. Speak of a dropped torch, a boiling pot, a candle to near linen. Any of them might reduce an insula, a 5-story apartment building, to ashes within minutes. That's why the vigils stored water buckets in alley recesses and at station houses. They even formed bucket lines by torchlight, lugging water from wells or the Tiber. They chainsawed through roofs and walls to cut fire breaks. They demolished any nearby buildings if necessary. They donned strips of damp cloth across their faces, wet wool wrapped around their hands, then charged into smoke. The night fire was the embodiment of their nightmare. It moved faster, it confused the eye, it trapped the sleeping dot. Then, the city wept, and the vigils ran in. Privener, I cremini noturni, concerns about the night. Time to night law, the presentimenta reluctant premonitions. 'Twas for flames. Alone the night was not. It was for thieves. Cutthroats, smugglers. Smugglers, and silence that felt wrong. So the vigils also worked as patrolmen, holding torches in one hand and short swords on their hips. They roamed marketplaces to halt looting. They dispersed late-night brawls around taverns. They rounded up drunks who fell over in the streets and thieves who slunk through windows like cats. In Rome, night crime was a regular occurrence. Thieves worked in teams, setting up false distractions as one reached a hand under a tunic. Thieves climbed wooden balconies to arrive from above, and sometimes gangs would pay bribes to doormen, who would open shops in the early morning and make off with goods until sunrise. The vigils used trained informants. They went disguised in civilian clothing to watch the troublemakers. They filed detailed commentary logs of incidents, arrests, and suspicious developments. And when things got out of hand, they summoned the cohorts urbanae, a paramilitary force for civil uprisings. Night was lawless, but it was not unguarded. The watchtowers and signal fires above them. The vigils manned the city's watchtowers specular build, on top of buildings or at the gates. And from these perches, they scanned the horizon for signs of smoke, artificial light, or large groups. Signals were burned if there was a fire or riot. A red flag during the day, a nighttime torch of colored fire, usually blue or green. Trumpets were sounded that pealed and rang through all the regions. These were the signals that set off a cascade. The squadrons on guard would draw together. The citizens would fly. The neighboring temples bar their doors. In wealthier districts, household slaves would already be throwing water across walls, while bodyguards prepared escape routes. Rome had no sirens. But when the sky lit up where it ought not, the city shifted, and the vigils led the way. The unsung dead, many vigils died in silence, of broken beams, inhaled smoke, knife wounds, or disease caught in the underbelly of the city. There were no parades, no statues, but some were honored. In small ways, a stele in Trastevere, to a vigiles, who saved 12 persons dying crushed by an arch. A mosaic in Ostia, featuring a bucket line, arms extended with one another as they pour out liquid. reads sailors per safety through night. Bronze tablet discovered near the Subura recording the names of the victims of one such terrible fire. They were not senators or consuls, but they kept Rome together while the world slept. Keepers of the mystical and the esoteric vigils were stationed at some temples not to cultivate the divine, but to ensure the holy remained unprofaned. Ritual thefts of this kind, particularly of objects made of gold or silver, were not unknown. The temples turned rowdy on some of the other festivals, and certain cults, particularly the mysteries, needed discreet protection. Others guarded the doors of the elite domus, hired privately to protect clients or look for assassins. They verified the identity of visitors. They carried passwords between parties, and sometimes the raptors served as lookouts for political dealings, too sensitive to risk exposure. By night, the vigils were a bunch of stuff. Firemen, detectives, messengers, guards, duty, and weariness gleamed in their eyes. The silence between torches, and yet, despite all their vigilance, they couldn't prevent every fire, every robbery, every betrayal. Sometimes they arrived too late. It was sometimes too shadowy. At other times, they had only walked past a window from which a cry had been muzzled too soon. Rome was too vast, too old, too layered with secrets, but still, they walked by lamplight and moonlight, with buckets and swords and sandals, shrunken to frayedness by cobblestones, in tunics heavy with soot, saying little, for they knew to live in Rome was to live at the point of collapse, and it was their marching that held the line. While the city's censors patrolled and the gods kept watch from their temples, Rome's night took on a vaster palette behind closed doors. The streets could be loud, the sewers could breathe, the fires could sullenly burn, but there, in its secret chambers, the night whispered itself away. Dysix would sometimes also recall. The moths would throw themselves against the candle, on all of which would happen to float talcum powder. This was the night of lovers and liars, and murmured conspiracies, and of promises that might not survive the first light of day. The atrium's quiet corners the houses of Rome were designed around. The atrium, an open courtyard that served as the center of family life, but as oil lamps were snuffed out and staff withdrew, private chambers were sanctuaries from the day's demands. Here, in these rooms, embellished with fresco and mosaic, shadows grew. A senator could retreat to his cubiculum in order to succumb to a favored mistress, such a woman being of grace and guile, and an adept of the silences. Their talk was heavy with politics and the politics of desire. Or it might be that a young patrician woman, swaddling herself in wool and silence, was hearing sibilanted offers from a freedman who knew more with his hands than he could with his tongue. These relationships, lord and slave, patrician and plebeian, wife and lover, were bound by the rigid social mores of Roman culture, but the night rendered these lines porous. The courtesans and their clients, prostitutes, courtesans, meretresses, were not all prostitutes. Some were highly educated and influential. They moved fluidly between worlds, but by night, in disguise and in secret rooms above taverns or behind villas on the fringes, they entertained senators, soldiers and merchants. They listened, they advised, they whispered. Some courtesans possessed information that could ruin careers or spark wars. Their favors were currency, their company, power. At night, a tavern's back room might be transformed into a seat of intrigue. Whispered conversation here could determine the fate of a province. The bedroom as a statua. Cubiculum was both a vulnerable and performative space, and lights the color of stained glass throw eerie tones onto marble and silk. Perfumed oils scented the air. Threads of gold whispered lightly through cushioned pillows. But it wasn't just passion in the bedroom. It was the place where power was quietly exercised, where alliances were sealed with kisses, where jealousies glowed brighter than any forge, where bread could be poisoned with wine. And where dreams of empire occasionally faded into shadows. Dreams and omens in the night. The Romans thought dreams were communications from the gods or the dead to prepare for sleep. They might mutter prayers or burn incense to the manes, the spirits of ancestors, for protection or guidance. Others wore amulets or carved symbols into their pillows for nightmares. However, not all dreams were so benign. A senator dreaming of a broken laurel wreath would fear loss of honor. A soldier who dreams of bloody sandals might be preparing for battle or for death. A woman who dreams of a black dog on her doorstep can expect treachery. Onirocrates were also applied to the smallest particulars. Dreams could influence decisions as much as waking advice, family secrets and night confessions. There was also a more ominous intimacy that the night contained. Family secrets. Fathers murmured instructions into sons' ears about inheritance and duty. Mothers worried aloud about their daughters' marriages. There were fears that siblings shared, but feared daylight would reveal. And in odd moments of confessional vulnerability, husbands and wives revealed truths that otherwise were buried under veneers of public persona. The night was an evening of confession, one time cathartic, another time manipulative. The danger of night. Visitors one night. Some of the newcomers weren't so friendly. There were people who banged on doors with bad intentions. Secret lovers, seeking forbidden rendezvous. Enemies trying to send a threat or a message. Spies sent to gather information. Slaves, escaping their masters. Elaborate security had long been for the rich and powerful. Locks, bolts, armed guards. But the confusing tangle of Lisbon's streets made escape and intrusion simpler for the initiated. The soundtrack of the night behind closed doors. The night had a score. The sound of his own silk robes. The murmur of lovers' voices. The creak of wooden beds. The clatter of cups, passing wine around or spilling it. These are the sighs of relief or exasperation. Sounds from outside. The barking of faraway dogs. The slamming of gates. An occasional call reminded all listeners that the city slept but at intervals. Rome's night was alive with its embraces, with its bedroom, where power was personal, where love was political, and where the smallest secrets could change the course of history. The Rome night, under the splendor of marble temples and imperial forums, had its shadowy side. During the day, the city was a land order town, or so the senators kept saying, but with sunset and torches flickering to life, Shadow World came to life. Thieves and smugglers, assassins and informers. They could only be bound by the sorcery. Most had come there to escape. Justice was swift, often harsh and at times blind. In that secret world, the night was both sanctuary and confinement. The city's criminal underbelly. Rome was a city of contrasts. Its affluence sat next to the most dire poverty. Its order masked chaos. City District Fortuna was notorious for its tenements and taverns, known for their high crime rate. Pickpockets in gangs controlled corners. Prostitutes vied for customers in the light from their lanterns. Slaves ran into stealthy holes called undercut streets, out of their master's sight. On the other side of the Subura, docks were thronged with smugglers. Imported goods were tugged through customs under the cover of darkness, occasionally brought up through the criminal syndicates. Black markets were doing big business in stolen merchandise, drugs and illegal scrolling texts. The night was their kingdom. Thieves and their tricks. Roman robbers were crafty and employed a variety of techniques. Now the fur thief was primarily on foot, displaying agility and distraction. The lateral robber was violent, assaulting travelers or individuals alone. Burglaries included scaling wooden balconies or breaking flimsy locks. Pickpockets worked in crowded markets or on festive days when the pandemonium ruled. Some of the thieves were in organized gangs, and some were working alone. Bribery was common. Guards and officials could be bribed to turn a blind eye or to send warnings, as detailed in the contract signed 500 years ago. But the law was always nipping at their heels. The Roman night, the Roman justice system. After dark the days may have been long. Court was open all day, but the pursuit of justice often carried beyond sundown in the arrests, interrogations and punishments that followed. Vigils or cohorts, urbanae, overnight, could detain a suspect, confined in carceres inside, underground prisons or carteras, the dark and wet holding cells at the city underbelly. Torture was used to obtain confessions, particularly to capital crimes like treason or murder. Executions were public, in the light of day, but in the dark. Secret killings and disappearances were whispered about. The law of Rome was severe, but sometimes arbitrary. Freedom could be purchased, and poverty could mean death. The secret prisons and covert cells beneath Rome. Labyrinthian dungeons lurked. Some were official, others clandestine. Infamous was the Mamertine prison near the Forum, which housed prisoners of the state and those sentenced to die. But rumors circulated of private cells tucked away in patrician basements or villa outbuildings, in which political prisoners were held, sometimes namelessly. Guards walked along these chilling corridors at night, walking noisily in the silent murmurs sounded in the distance. by men's repressed sobs. To be incarcerated in Rome was to be thrown into the blackest shadow of the city. Punishments of the night executions were common public spectacles, but other punishments were more private or reserved as titillating. Midnight warnings in alleys from view. Public humiliation in the forms of brands or shaved heads. Slave labor in quarries or on the docks, often starting at daybreak after a night of hopelessness. Exile. It was usually the sentence of secret council. Some of the punished were slaves, others were free citizens, but all were certain that Rome's justice was merciless. Informants and spies when the lights were out. Anyone could be a suspect. One tool to detect conspiracies and crimes involving treachery was the informant delator. Both were feared and loathed. A whisper in the ear of the right person could damn a senator. There may be a shadowy figure lurking in a tavern, reporting to the Praetorian Guard. The informers owned perpetually precarious lives, hung always on the watch, always in hiding. Crime as survival for many. Crime for Romans was not a matter of choice, but of necessity. When slaves stole, Islamic law allowed slaves who took food to escape abuse. The indigent sold other stolen goods in exchange to grain. Women traded favors to keep children safe. It was all about survival, any way we could, in a city that could be so cruel. She said of the night. The Rome night was febrile with contrasts between order and chaos, justice and cruelty, survival and despair. And as soon as dawn broke, the shadows would vanish, yet their tales would be recorded forever in the stone and blood of the city. And while emperors feasted in gilded halls and priests nurtured eternal fires, Rome's real heart beat on in the streets and taverns and workshops that never quite slept. The Roman night was more than a mere cessation of sound and light. It was an era of sound, toil, gaiety, ambition, survival, and song for ordinary people whose hands and voices built the British Empire. The markets that don't sleep, and the food vendors who feel the most pain while most markets closed when the sun went down. Some traders worked late. Street hawkers were selling warm bread, salted fish and spiced wine to laborers wrapping up late shifts. Fishmongers tiptoed and carried their catch in from the Tiber to sell by lantern light. Popine. Less prestigious eateries where the lower classes would eat would leave. The smell of cooked meats in the air, in areas such as the Subura and Trastevere. These nighttime stalls served as places to catch up with the gossip and news of the day. Artisans and craftsmen working late. Some crafts required night's quiet. Leatherworkers, blacksmiths, potters, working by the light of candles, were making the goods for the following day. These craftspeople frequently resided above their shops in small apartments. Their labor was necessary, from horseshoes to household tools, from jewelry to weapons. Lurid light from the reek of their furnaces and forges that burned with imprisoned fire did not bring to the gloom of the pale fog dark, but showed it hovering above and around them, as if they were scudding with the wind. And the wind was blowing from the seas. Taverns and social hubs. Many Romans regarded taverns Capone and Popine as the social center of the night. Here, commoners sipped cheap wine, played dice games, and swapped the latest news. Tavern keepers knew a great deal who owed money, who had been locked up, who had caught the eye of the local magistrate. Some of the taverns acted as informal courts of justice, where disputes were settled by fists or bargains. The more one laughed, the more alive the city felt. Street performers and entertainers, minstrels, dancers and acrobats performed for the nighttime visitors, while extravagant stage plays were reserved for daytime. More modest entertainments roamed marketplaces or took over taverns. Storytellers wove stories of gods and heroes. Soldiers sang songs of battles. Musicians played lyres and flutes by the light of the stars. These performers preserved the oral traditions that bound together Rome's various peoples. Nighttime, laborers and porters. There was work to be done in the city forever, day and night. Warehouses lined the city's rivers, and one end of the cargo chain was stevedores, who worked in the city's docks and wharves. Water carriers equerri brought fresh water to houses in vessels of skins. Street cleaners worked too, cleared debris from the road and keep the roads open. These laborers simply toiled in the dark, largely unseen and unappreciated. Their sweat and toil propped up Rome's everyday life. Unseen. The slaves, whose lives were shaped by neat, a sizable proportion of the population consisted of slaves. They did domestic work at night, cleaning, cooking, keeping fires. Some looked through barred windows, Others guarded houses or followed their masters to late meetings. Others slipped away from their owners, if only for a moment, to mix and see loved ones in the streets, even when they were shackled. Their night could be a taste of freedom. The noises and odors of the night. The night was music of Rome. The rattle of wooden wheels on cobblestones, barking of dogs, and neighing of horses, the sound of temple bells from afar, the smell of roasted meat blended with the other, more odious odor of refuse. For many of them, it was a comforting sight that the city was vibrant and healthy. Rome was more than just the city of emperors and senators. It was the millions city living, working, dreaming in the shadows of the night. As the city fell into darkness, another world awakened, one of whispered prayers, hurrying steps, flickering oil lamps lighting up makeshift clinics, and humble homes. Since the time of the first Caesar, when the eternal city was the center of the known world, it was possible to be in awe of Rome even as it burned, to attack it, yet recoil from its madness and beauty, and to understand that, amid its depravities, lies and murder, there were still honest folks struggling to survive, to perform their duty as clerks and shopkeepers, as doctors and nurses and teachers. The Roman doctor and his instruments. Roman doctors. Medici were part experts and part magicians. Others had a Hippocratic and Galenic training, having some knowledge of anatomy and medicinal plants. Still others used charms, amulets and spells. Their tools were primitive by contemporary standards: scalpels, forceps, cauteries, and cupping glasses. At night, doctors made their way into homes where no one would set foot alone, helping with births, sewing up lacerations, sweating out fevers. Midwives and childbirth. At night, childbirth was one of the most perilous times in Roman life. Mothers frequently lay, physically supported by midwives, obstetresses, in quiet rooms filled only with small lamps or candles, with herbal poultices and prayers. They helped to ease pain and ensure delivery. The night was young and wearying. It might be that long, and hesitating. Families stood close by, murmuring hopes and fears. Out of your control. If a birth was successful, lineage was secure. If not, there was grief and sometimes scandal. The healing temples and night pilgrimages. For many Romans, healing was as much spiritual as it was physical. Temples to Asclepius, the healing god, and Apollo, his divine father, were pilgrimage destinations. They would come there to pray, make votive offerings, and receive a dream of cure. Extra ceremonies were held at some temples late into the night. Pilgrims would sleep in the abaton, a dormitory where they had hoped for divine visions to direct their healing. Superstition and medicine. Medicine was practiced in a world laced with superstition. Fending off evil spirits and curses was as essential as addressing the symptoms. Patients tried amulets, chanted spells, and sipped potions brewed from exotic ingredients. Doctors would frequently prescribe rituals as they prescribed herbs, burning incense, calling on a god, or making a symbolic washing. Science and magic mingled in the dancing shadows of the sickroom. Plague and epidemics, and the night watcher's disease, was nothing new to Rome. Fear and chaos frequently worsened at night when epidemics hit. Day and night, doctors, attendants, and nurses served with their very faces cropped and trembling with toil. Hosque egris adulti, et sani interposito loco parti ebriatatis, rapt improperantes, agro salarius nudiband, posterior nudo et diosum, manu, stridula et cribra gestantes, protegente, homine, ruinarum, in agmine, fugiente, deserpiens, also partem et corporis illudente. Distaban. The sick were driven in terror into their houses or special wards. Priests prayed for intervention, doctors for cures in texts and remedies. The city's vigilance was challenged not merely by fire or crime, but by enemies that could not be seen. Healing and hospitality. Roman hospitals in their modern sense did not exist, but valetudinaria, military, and nursing homes did at least provide a service to the ailing men of the legions. In the city itself, wealthy benefactors sometimes supported private clinics run by Greek physicians. Acts of feeding the hungry or treating the sick were connected with status in society and religious obligation. By night, servants dispensed medicines, dressed wounds, and brewed up potions that could be the difference between life and death. The night was a time for fear and hope, science and superstition, pain and care. Silently and desperately, the fight for health was waged in the dim light of the flickering lamps and soft-tinted chambers. Rome, the eternal city, a cradle of empires and gods. But while the world knows the glory, the marble ruins, the soaring domes, the golden light that spills over the 7 hills, few ever see the other Rome, the Rome of shadows, of whispers, of stolen glances beneath torch gaslight and criminal secrets buried under ancient cobblestones, not one of emperors or wars, at any rate not entirely. This is the story of lives lost on the edge of history, of one night that extended into legend, a night filled with chance and a city that appeared to almost breathe. Enter slow pan through narrow streets, glimmering oil lamps, shadowy figures. It started, like many a tale in Rome, in Trastevere, the quarter across the Tiber, a labyrinth of stony alleys, balconies hung with flowers, and voices that were music at night. 1497, and Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, is at the height of his career and his city on the brink of a new future. Renaissance. The cardinals' palaces glistened with excess, but behind the doors, conspiracies were penned across parchment and sealed in blood. The house of Borgia ruled with an iron golden hand, dipped in poison. But not everyone was playing by the rules in Rome. Not everyone feared their name. And so, on a clammy evening in June, under a sky rippled with Roman stars, a new game began. Cut to a bustling piazza in Trastevere, an ambient street performance. Laughter, clinking goblets, the lonely note of a violin threading the air. Enter Lucia Bellundi, 22, daughter of a ruined merchant, scribe in the service of secrets. She strides along, dark curls tucked up, in .sig.rev, .shot1.tif.sig.rev, shot1.tif.sig.re, shot1.tif.tonight. She bears a scroll branded with the red seal of the Borgia insignia. Lucia was young when she learned that knowledge, more than love or gold, was the most formidable currency in Rome. Her father, a heavy drinker and a bookseller with gambling debts, had tried to sell her into marriage to a Neapolitan trader. She escaped that night and never turned back. The streets became her tutors, the alleys her confessional. By 16 she was better at counterfeiting the seal of the Pope than most of the monks in the Vatican scriptoria. But this letter, this night, was different. In the sealed envelope, a map, not of Rome, but under it. There are camera pans, across an old map, aqueducts, tunnels, and the subterranean chambers beneath the Vatican. The note that came with it was brief. For words, he's still busy living. Lucia didn't have to inquire as to who he was. Isa Borgia, the Pope's spawn, the merciless condottiero, the devil in red armor, hadn't been spotted in more than a fortnight. The rumors swirled all around like mist, ambush, betrayal, death even. Rome's underworld held its breath. With Caesar gone, the fragile equilibrium between corruption, bloodshed, and governance was in jeopardy. But if this letter was accurate, Caesar was alive, imprisoned, not in a castle tower, but inside the earth. Lucia suspected she had mere hours before others discovered what she now possessed. And so she ran, not toward safety, but deeper into the city's capillaries. Cut to a candle-filled chamber directly below a dilapidated tenement in the Jewish quarter. There is a man over a chessboard, half concealed in shadow. Meet Samuel D. Costello, a philosopher who's become an information broker. Once a student in the University of Padua, now a ghost in the archives of Rome, Samuel traded in the truths the church wanted buried beneath the floor. To some, he was a traitor. To others, a prophet. Lucia didn't trust anyone, except him. Lucia whispers, "They've buried him under the catacombs. I saw the markings myself." This, she extends the letter, was in the ambassador's own hand. Samuel taking the letter. "This map is ancient, even compared to Rome. Look here. These tunnels predate the Forum. Mithraic, pagan. A prisoner isn't on the lam on you, Lucia. You're opening up a door that's been closed since even before the time of Christ." Silence. The sound of distant thunder. The city creaks, groans, as if it heard him. In the taverns and palazzos the folk danced, unaware, as was so often the case, that Rome was preparing to bleed anew, but in a different part. The ultimate tower of Vatican, Pope Alexander was gazing at a mirror. Behind him, a woman in a silk robe dragged her fingers along the lip of his desk. Lucretia Borgia, his daughter, a vision of grace and threat. She wore innocence like perfume, but her mind was steel. "Lucretia, father, do you remember what you said in there? That only the fittest, not as in strength of power, but of storytelling survive. Lies have simply been outfitted for court. Alexander Vi, and you, dear, are always well dressed. They laughed, but under the laughter was a fear that they would not name. In a city as old as this, they never keep their secrets very deep. They wait, patiently, in frescoes, in sewers, in dirty reliquaries no one is willing to open. Lucia and Samuel traced the way under the Tiber, under memory, really. Every torch they ignited created different shadows. There were inscriptions on the walls, in Latin, in Greek, in Etruscan. Some were so old that only the dead knew them anymore. What they discovered was not just Cesare. They found something far older, far more dangerous, a ritual interrupted, a truth so terrible I'd hardly dare say it. Winds pass through the catacombs, torches flicker. There is a low groan, not of man, nor of beast. Rome opens, startled, not like morning's innocent gaze, but like a well-practiced courtesan's dissembling glance from a strained night's bed. The streets may be clean, the fountains may sparkle, but just below the surface, the whispers persist. Secrets do not sleep, they simply change masks. And on this morn of the 2nd day of June in the year of our Lord 1497, the city awoke beneath a fresh weight. A letter had moved hands, a truth had broken free, and there, something buried deep had come to open its eyes. We rejoin Lucia, sitting in a dark candlelit room. She tightens a bandage around her left arm, fresh scrapings from the tunnels, and looks at her reflection on a cracked mirror. The parchment map is stretched out on the table next to her, held open by rocks. Lucia Belandi had not been afraid of death, but now there was something new blossoming in her chest, not fear, really dread. Fear because she had seen the runes carved into the stone under the city. For the man she'd discovered, deep within the catacombs, was not altogether human anymore, and fear because someone had followed her home. Footsteps echo on cobblestones outside, a soft knock. She grabs a dagger, silent voice whispers, "It's me, Samuel." She opens the door cautiously. He bursts in, pale and sweating, and holding a charred scrap of parchment. "Samuel, otherwise, they have begun the clean-out of the Jewish quarter. There's word that a devil roamed the catacombs last night. The guards are burning documents, all of them." Lucia, then we were right. The escape of Cesare is only a portion of it. Samuel grim, Lucia, ... what was down there was not Cesare. Flashback, a flickering torchlight scene, the stooping figure in the shadows, the muttered Latin incantations, the sigil glowing red as it's etched into stone. Lucia's face ashen with realization. The man they had discovered in the dark tunnels carried the voice, the face but not the soul of Cesare. His eyes flashed with something older, something alien. He had whispered the name of Mithras god, of secrets, god of under-earth fire. And when he'd spoken, the walls had shaken. There were Roman cults earlier than Christ's mystery religions that practiced their rites in secret chambers. Most were wiped out, or so it was believed. But now ... those fires were being rekindled. Samuel, the sigil, the red serpent on the stone, it's like the frescoes under San Clemente, Mithraic symbols. Lucia and Cesare Borgia was not a prisoner, he was a vessel. Silence hangs thick in silence. They sat, when a story developing across town tugged them awake, a one that would become intertwined with Lucia's destiny and that of Rome. Cut to Castelsa. The fortress prison is visible as the clouds begin forming overhead. Guards speed along its ramparts. In a dungeon cell far below the earth, a prisoner lies awake. He is Alessandro da Volterra, a former papal architect, become conspirator, narrator. Alessandro had made altars and tombs for the Vatican, but he had also sketched illicit maps. He had unearthed tunnels that were never meant to be traversed, and written poems that whispered truths the church had buried in ash. He was arrested 3 days earlier, but this morning he opens his eyes to find that the door to his cell is open. No guards, no sound. There was just one folded sheet of parchment lying neatly on the stone bench. Its sigil was the same, the red snake, and 5 words: "Find the girl, follow flame." He ventures out, weaving through deserted halls, the storm howling outside, a secret key to an overlooked passageway. Narrator, he did not know Lucia Belandi, but he knew the signs. The Mithraic cult had returned. The fires were kindling once more, and Rome, dear Rome, was again on the brink between empire and apocalypse. Cut to the Vatican. Adieu Pope Alexander VI is hunched over a desk, looking the worse for wear. A red-robed cardinal comes in, impassive. Cardinal Della Rovere, they say your son treads the catacombs once more, that he's alive after being dead. Alexander growling, Caesar never died. He was becoming what this city needs. Cardinal, you dabble with the old gods. Rodrigo, not even with the blood of Christ can they be drowned again. Lightning strikes. In the back of the chamber, Lucretia looks on, silent. Chapter 13. The Promise of Dawn. The night of sleep ends. Day begins with the first faint touch of pale light on the roofs, and the stars going down to their rest behind the edge of the world. Rome awoke. The secrets of the night dissolved with the shadows, but the echoes remained in whispered pledges, in smouldering torches, and in the dreams of any fool who ventured into the city after nightfall. The night's last watch towards dawn, the vigils did their last rounds, their torches dripping in the morning's breeze. Temples darknessed their lamps and nourished them again for daytime rites. The vending stands closed in, the crafters stowed away tools. The city collectively let out a long sigh, but the night was not gone. It survived in memory, in the tales recounted at breakfast tables, in the prayers murmured at dawn. Dreams carried into daylight. The Romans placed great significance on dreams at daybreak. They read omens in the visions that came to them in the night, visions of victory and defeat. These dreams influenced the choices of emperors and peasants. They were bled into the day as delicate, gleaming embers. The city's eternal cycle. Rome was a city of cycles. There was darkness before there was light, fire before water, silence before sound. But the night made the city as much as the marble and the stone. At once, a period of peril and power, terror and fortitude, secrecy and disclosure. In the silence, the soul of Rome was made. Whispers that outlast time, the murmur of lovers, the tread of the vigils, the supplication to the gods, the groan of the poor, all these made a rough music, little heard, but awfully felt. The night was big with stories, power won and lost, lives altered, secrets kept and told. They were inseparable from the texture of Rome's history, the people who lived with and in them, quiet witnesses to a city that never slept and in their presence never died. The night to come will bring its glory. The night receded as the city began to wake, but it waited for the moment of darkness to return. Every sunset, because there was a promise, a new night, new shadows, new stories. And Rome would be ready, always ready. I hope you have enjoyed your walking through the streets and whispers and dreams of Rome by night. May the tales you have heard linger in your nights, telling you that, long after the night has fallen, there is life and mystery and hope.